The hum of the hospital is a sound that gets inside you, becomes a part of your own biology. It's not just a noise, it's a presence. A low, constant thrum of electricity, of filtered air, of machines that mimic the functions of the body with their own steady, electronic pulses. It's the sound of life hanging in the balance, a symphony of fragility played on instruments of steel and plastic and hope. And in the heart of that symphony, my hands are the conductors. They don't shake. They can't afford to. In the space between a steady, reassuring heartbeat and the frantic, single-tone screech of a flatline, these hands are the only thing standing between a person and the infinite, silent void. I've always found a strange, profound comfort in that immense pressure. It simplifies the universe, reduces the chaotic, messy complexity of human existence into a single, luminous, and clear objective: cut, clamp, suture, save. The turmoil of life outside these walls, the tangled web of emotions, the heavy weight of history, the ghosts that whisper in the quiet moments, it all gets left at the heavy, swinging double doors of the operating theater. In here, under these blinding, sterile lights that wash away all color and shadow, I am not a daughter grieving a ghost. I am not a woman haunted by a past that feels like a phantom limb, an ache for a life that was stolen. I am Dr. Lena Evans. I am a surgeon. My scalpel is my truth, and my truth, my only truth in this sacred space, is that I fix what is broken. But that absolute truth, the very foundation upon which I had built my entire adult life, began to crack and splinter on a slow, rain-soaked Tuesday night. The kind of deep, dreary night that makes the bright city lights bleed into the wet, black pavement, smearing the world into a melancholic watercolor of gloom and reflection. I was in the on-call room, a cramped, impersonal space that perpetually smelled of stale coffee and the faint, clean, astringent scent of antiseptic that never quite leaves your skin, no matter how many times you wash. It was a scent I associated with control, with order. I was finishing paperwork, the mundane but necessary duty of logging procedures and signing off on orders, a small, quiet island of bureaucratic calm in the constant storm of medical crisis. The page was a sharp, electric buzz that shattered the quiet, its urgency vibrating right through the fabric of my exhaustion. The voice from the overhead speaker was clipped, professional, but it carried that specific, undeniable tension that immediately pricks the hairs on your arms and sends a jolt to your core. Level 1 trauma, ETA 3 minutes. MVA, driver, critical. BP 70 over palp, GCS 8. The words are a language of their own, a stark, unadorned poem of impending doom that every trauma surgeon learns to decode in an instant. My body went on autopilot, the familiar adrenaline a cold fire igniting in my veins, sharpening my senses, narrowing my focus to a laser point. I was already moving, my mind running through the mental checklist, visualizing the possible scenarios, the anatomical landmines that could be waiting. Blunt force trauma. Critical. The clock was already ticking, seconds bleeding away like the unseen hemorrhage we were rushing to meet. I was at the scrub sink, the ritualistic, almost meditative dance of the brush under my nails, the water scalding hot, washing away the dust and grime of the outside world. I was in my element. This was what I was made for, what I had sacrificed everything for. The chaotic symphony of a trauma arrival hit me before I even turned around, a wave of controlled panic and purpose. The whoosh of the automatic doors, the frantic, overlapping voices of the EMTs, the clatter of the gurney wheels, the relentless, rhythmic beeping of the portable monitor that was like a frantic, mechanical heartbeat of its own. I turned, my hands held up, sterile, as a nurse, Maria, her eyes calm and competent, tied my gown with practiced, efficient movements, her presence a familiar anchor in the storm. 58-year-old male, John Doe for now, an EMT was rattling off, his uniform dark with rain, his face etched with the strain of the pre-hospital battle. Massive blunt force trauma to the abdomen from the steering wheel. Suspected liver laceration, spleen looks bad, we're barely keeping up with the internal bleeding, 2 large bore IVs, we've pumped in 4 units of ONEG already. He was talking at the scene, then crumped on us. My eyes went to the patient, a routine, professional assessment born of 1,000 such moments. Pale, almost waxy skin, the color of a fish's belly. A tumble of gray hair, thick and streaked with silver, now matted with dark, drying blood. A strong, square jaw, now slack and vulnerable under the clear oxygen mask that misted with each shallow, mechanically assisted breath. My gaze traveled down, noting the bruising already blooming across his chest like a dark, ugly flower, the ominous distension of his abdomen that screamed of internal hemorrhage, a hidden ocean of blood where there should be none. And then my eyes, scanning, assessing, landed on it. My breath hitched, a tiny, almost imperceptible catch in my throat that, thank God, no one else in that frenetic room could have possibly noticed. It was on his left forearm, just above where a young, determined nurse was struggling to find a viable vein for another 4-line. A small, faded tattoo. A simple, clumsily rendered anchor. The blue ink had bled slightly at the edges over the decades, making it look even more primitive, a relic from a different time. The kind of tattoo a young, foolish man, full of bravado and cheap beer and a feeling of invincibility, might get on a reckless night out, a permanent mark of a temporary feeling, a symbol of stability he likely never possessed. I knew that tattoo. I knew it with a certainty that felt like a physical blow to the chest. The world didn't slow down. It didn't go quiet or dreamlike. The noise, if anything, became louder, a roaring, staticky waterfall in my ears that threatened to drown out everything else, the voices, the beeps, the hiss of oxygen. But inside that roaring, a single, crystal-clear memory erupted from the depths of my mind, vivid and brutal and suffocating in its intensity. I was 9 years old. It was a warm, golden summer evening, and the sweet, heavy scent of my mother's lavender bushes drifted through the open kitchen window, mingling with the smell of her homemade pasta sauce. We were waiting for my father to come home from a long day. Arthur Pendleton was there, his sleeve rolled up in the stifling heat, that stupid, blue anchor on his forearm resting on our red-checkered tablecloth as he drank my father's beer. He was laughing, his voice a booming, confident sound that seemed to fill the entire room, pushing back the walls. He and my father were more than business partners, they were brothers in all but blood. They had started a small construction company together, Rossi and Pendleton. My father, Antonio, was the quiet, hardworking backbone, the craftsman who believed in integrity and solid foundations. Arthur was the charismatic frontman, the silver-tongued charmer who could win over clients and secure loans with a smile and a handshake. That night, he was leaning forward, animated, telling my father about a new, big deal, a sprawling suburban development project that was going to set them up for life, make them rich, make all the struggle worth it. "It's a sure thing, Tony," he'd said, his eyes gleaming, clapping my father firmly on the back. "We're gonna be kings." I remember the look of absolute, unwavering trust in my father's eyes, the way he smiled, a real, easy smile I hadn't seen in a while. I remember feeling safe, wrapped in that warmth. The next memory crashed into the first, a 1-2 punch to my soul that left me reeling there in the ore. It was months later. The same kitchen, but the air was cold and heavy, the warmth and the lavender scent long gone. My mother was crying silently at the table, her shoulders shaking, a crumpled tissue in her hand. My father's face was ashen, his eyes fixed on nothing. Arthur was there again, but he wasn't laughing. His voice was low, pleading, desperate. The anchor tattoo seemed to taunt me from across the room, a symbol of everything that was about to be lost. The deal had gone catastrophically bad. The money, all of it, my father's entire life savings, the company's assets, the equity in our home, everything, was gone. Vanished. Arthur was full of excuses, a dishonest partner he vouched for, a sudden collapse in the market, a cascade of bad luck, forces beyond his control. "It wasn't my fault, Tony," he kept saying, his voice cracking with a performative grief that I now see as the height of cowardice. "You have to believe me. We were screwed." But the truth wasn't in his words. The truth was in the eviction notice sitting on the table like a dead thing. The truth was in the bank foreclosure papers. The truth was in the way Arthur finally, after an hour of empty apologies, stood up, avoided my mother's weeping eyes, and walked out of our house, got into his car, and drove away from our lives, leaving a crater of financial and emotional ruin behind him. He never looked back. He never called. He simply disappeared, a ghost who had burned down our world before vanishing into the mist. My father, a proud, quiet man who had built his life with his own 2 hands, who believed a man's word was his bond, never recovered. The shame was a cancer, eating him from the inside out. The debt was a heavy chain around his neck, dragging him down. The betrayal by his best friend, the brother he had chosen, was the final, killing blow. He lost his business, then our beautiful, creaky old house with the porch swing and the sprawling lavender bushes out front. The laughter that had once echoed in its halls was replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by my mother's sniffles or the grim sound of my father sighing in the dark. I watched my mother, Isabella, grow thin and perpetually worried, her beautiful, radiant smile becoming a rare, fragile thing I barely saw anymore, a relic from a happier past. I watched my father's broad shoulders, once so strong they could carry me for miles, stoop under the weight of it all. The vibrant light in his kind, gentle eyes was extinguished, replaced by a hollow, devastating defeat. He died 2 years later, in a cramped, dark apartment that always smelled of damp and despair. The doctor, a kind, tired man, called it a massive myocardial infarction. A heart attack. But I knew, even as a 12-year-old child, I knew with every fiber of my being that it was a broken heart. My mother was just a ghost after that, a shell of the woman she had been, living in a single rented room, working 2, sometimes 3 menial jobs, her spirit as bankrupt as our bank account had been. She worked until her hands were raw and her back ached, just to keep a flimsy roof over our heads and to put me through school, her own dreams and joys reduced to ashes. All of it. Every lost moment, every tear I wiped away in secret, every silent, joyless dinner, every birthday without a present, every night I fell asleep to the sound of my mother's muffled sobs from the other side of a thin wall, it all led back, in an unbroken chain of causality, to the man now lying unconscious, bleeding out on my operating table. A coldness, deeper and more profound than any I had ever felt, spread through me. It started in my chest, a lump of glacial ice, and radiated outwards, freezing the blood in my veins, numbing my fingers and toes. It was a void, a perfect, absolute silence that swallowed the frantic beeps of the monitors, the shouted orders, the hiss of the ventilator, Maria's calm voice. This wasn't a patient. This was the architect of my grief. This was the specter that had haunted my every success, my every failure, my every relationship. This was the reason I had spent my teenage years studying by a single, dim lamp in that cold, lonely apartment, fueled by a furious, burning determination to never, ever be that vulnerable again. To be the one in control, the one who held the line against the chaos and cruelty of the world. To be a fixer. A savior. My entire career, my entire life's purpose, my very identity, had been built on the foundation of his destruction. And now, fate, in its cruel, exquisitely ironic wisdom, had delivered him to me, utterly helpless, his life literally balanced on the tips of my fingers. The universe had handed me the scales of justice, and it was waiting to see which way I would make them tip. My first thought was not of anatomy or surgical procedure. It was a hot, sharp, blinding wave of pure, unadulterated vengeance, so potent it made me dizzy. It would be so easy. A mere hesitation, a fraction of a second too long. A bleeder missed, just for a moment, disguised by the general ooze of the field. A subtle, deliberate miscalculation in the suture. A clamp applied with a fraction less care, allowing just enough leakage. No one in this room, with their trust and their professional respect, would ever know. They would call it a tragic complication, an injury too severe to survive. The damage was extensive, after all, his body was a roadmap of trauma. He would just slip away on the table, and a 25-year-old debt, a debt of a childhood, of a father, of a mother's spirit, would finally be paid in full. The justice the lawyers and the courts never gave us, the justice my father died waiting for, the justice my mother never even dared to hope for, I could deliver right here, in this sterile, bright room, with the world none the wiser. I could be the judge, the jury, and the executioner. My scalpel could be the sword of retribution. Dr. Evans? Your plan? The resident's voice, young, eager, slightly nervous, cut through the static in my head like a knife. It was David, a brilliant kid with a promising future, who looked at me with something bordering on reverence. He was looking at me, his eyes wide, trusting, waiting for guidance. He saw Dr. Lena Evans, the unflappable attending trauma surgeon, the one with the legendary calm under pressure and the so-called golden hands. He didn't see the little girl, Lena Rossi, hiding in a closet, listening to her parents' world disintegrate into shouts and sobs. He didn't see the teenager who had to choose between buying a required textbook and buying lunch, who patched her only pair of school shoes with tape. I looked down at my hands. They were still. They were ready. They were trained, honed, perfected over decades of relentless practice to save lives. Any life. Every life. And then I heard my own voice, calm and steady, as if it were coming from someone else, from the certain automaton I had trained myself to be, the persona I retreated into when the emotions became too great. Let's begin. Massive transfusion protocol, keep it wide open. Get me a laparotomy tray. We're going in. The words felt like heavy, jagged stones in my mouth, each one a betrayal of the little girl I had been. The first cut is always a profound commitment. It is the moment the abstract plan becomes irreversible, physical reality. The skin, that final, personal barrier, parts under the scalpel, a clean, deliberate line down the midline of his abdomen. There is no going back. The retractors are placed, cold metal teeth biting into tissue, holding the wound open like a grotesque, blooming flower, and the internal chaos is revealed in all its bloody glory. It was worse than the scans had suggested, a landscape of ruin. His liver was a mangled, purple mess, dark blood welling up from a deep, jagged tear that snaked across its surface like a malicious river. His spleen was a pulped, bloody sack, beyond salvage. The coppery, metallic smell of blood filled the air, thick and cloying, a scent I knew better than my own perfume. This was a body fighting a brutal, losing battle against forces it was never meant to withstand. As my hands moved, diving into the warm, wet wreckage of his body, a different, more ferocious battle raged inside me. My professional instinct was a relentless, disciplined drumbeat, a mantra beaten into me through years of training: clamp, suction, pack, find the source, identify, isolate, repair. My hands knew what to do, their movements precise and efficient, a complex, life-saving dance I had performed 1,000 times. They were mapping the terrain of his body, a geography of crisis, with an intelligence that was almost separate from my conscious mind. But my heart was a screaming, wounded animal, trapped in a cage of my own making. This is the man who stole your father's laugh. This is the man who put those permanent, deep lines of worry on your mother's beautiful face. This is the man who turned your safe, warm home into a memory of loss and lack. He doesn't deserve your skill. He doesn't deserve the precious, donated blood we're pumping into him. He doesn't deserve the second chance you're about to give him. He deserves to face the consequences. Let the darkness take him. It's what he deserves. It's what your father deserves. I could feel the eyes of my team on me, their focus a tangible pressure. Maria, the scrub nurse, anticipating my every move, her hands a mirror of readiness, passing instruments before I even asked for them. David, the resident, watching my every technique, his eyes wide, learning, absorbing. Dr. Abrams, the anesthesiologist, his focus entirely on the monitors, his voice a steady, calm commentary on the patient's precarious vitals, the lifeline to the man's stability. Their trust was a physical weight, an anchor trying to hold me fast in the storm of memory and pure hatred that was threatening to capsize my sanity, to drown the surgeon and leave only the vengeful daughter. I looked at the monitor. His blood pressure was dipping dangerously low, the numbers a flashing red warning of imminent cardiac arrest. A part of me, a dark, wounded, feral part that I kept locked away in the deepest part of my soul, felt a grim, shameful flicker of satisfaction. See? He's failing. His body is giving up. It's nature taking its course. You wouldn't even have to do anything. Just, be a little slower. Be a little less perfect. Then my fingers, guided by an intuition born of years of experience, found the epicenter of the storm, the ground zero of his mortality. A torn branch of the hepatic artery. Blood pulsed out in a relentless, rhythmic, bright red stream, a tiny, violent fountain of life forcefully leaving its vessel. This was it. The true, irrevocable point of no return. To repair it would be difficult, intricate, microsurgical work. It would require all my focus, all my skill, every ounce of my concentration. It would be a testament to my craft, to my years of training. To hesitate, to fumble just for a second, to lose control of the vessel for a moment too long, just a heartbeat longer than necessary, would be a death sentence. A natural, unavoidable, tragic death on the table. And I did everything I could, it was just too much moment. A quiet, secret murder in a room full of witnesses. I stood there, my index finger pressed hard against the pulsing, bleeding vessel, a temporary, fragile dam against the tide of his life. The pressure of the blood against my gloved finger was a frantic, rhythmic tap-tap-tapping, a countdown clock to a decision I never thought I would have to make. In that suspended, eternal moment, the ore faded away. I was 10 years old again. I was in my father's study, the day before the men came to take the furniture. He was sitting in his big, worn leather chair, the one that smelled of pipe tobacco and old books, just staring out the grimy window at a world that had betrayed him. He didn't know I was there, hiding in the doorway. I saw him bring his hands to his face, his big, strong, calloused hands that could build a house, that could fix anything, and his shoulders shook with silent, ragged, body-racking sobs. I had never, ever seen my father cry. The sound was worse than any shouting. It was the sound of a soul being shredded, of a man's entire being breaking into a million irreparable pieces. It was the sound of a world ending. The memory was a physical blow, a sucker punch to the gut that drove the air from my lungs. The hatred surged back, a bitter, acrid poison in my throat, blinding in its intensity, a white-hot rage that demanded action. Let him go. For Dad. Do it for Dad. This is your chance. This is the justice he was denied. This is for all the Christmases that were quiet, for all the birthdays without presents, for the light that went out in your mother's eyes. This is for you. But then, as if in response to the darkness, another memory surfaced, softer, slower, but just as powerful, an antidote to the poison. It was my first day of medical school. We stood in a grand, wood-paneled hall, hundreds of bright-eyed, idealistic young men and women, our futures a blank slate before us, and we recited the Hippocratic Oath together, our voices a united, solemn chorus. The words had felt ancient and heavy then, laden with a responsibility I was only beginning to grasp. I will remember that I remain a member of society, with special obligations to all my fellow human beings, those sound of mind and body as well as the infirm. I will remember that there is art to medicine as well as science, and that warmth, sympathy, and understanding may outweigh the surgeon's knife or the chemist's drug. And the most famous line of all, the one that was etched into the very wall of the lecture hall, the one that was the bedrock of our profession, first, do no harm. It wasn't just an oath. It was a promise. A sacred promise I had made not just to that hall, or to my professors, or to my future patients, but to myself. A promise to be the opposite of everything Arthur Pendleton represented. He was chaos and destruction and selfishness and betrayal. I would be order and healing and selflessness and unwavering integrity. If I let him die, if I became the deliberate, secret instrument of his death, then what was the point of it all? What was the point of all the sacrifices, all the sleepless nights studying, all the years of grueling training, all the birthdays and holidays spent in this hospital? He would have destroyed me, too. He would have reached out from the past and his grave and turned the healer into a killer, the savior into an executioner. My revenge wouldn't be a victory, it would be my final, utter, and most complete defeat. He would have taken my father, my childhood, and finally, my soul. My eyes met Dr. Abrams over the blue drape that separated the head from the body, the mind from the repair. His pressure's crashing, he said, his voice tight with controlled alarm. We're losing him. I've pushed another unit of AP, but he's not responding well. I took a breath, a deep, deliberate, shuddering gulp of the sterile, blood-tinged air. I made my choice. Not for him. For me. More suction. I need a vascular clamp. The fine one. No. My voice was a razor, cutting through the thick, palpable tension in the room. I'm going to repair this. Stay with me, people. Talk to me, Abrams. Keep him with us. Don't let him go. The next few hours were a blur of intense, microscopic, all-consuming focus. The world narrowed to the few square inches of bloody, complex tissue in front of me, a universe contained within a single, traumatic wound. The vengeful thoughts, the searing memories, the corrosive hatred, they didn't disappear, but they were silenced, pushed to the very edges of my consciousness by the sheer, overwhelming technical demand of the task. It was like performing a high-wire act in a hurricane. There was no room for anything but the next step, the next stitch, the next decision. I sutured the torn artery with stitches so fine they were almost invisible, my hands moving with a grace and steadiness that felt completely separate from the churning, emotional maelstrom inside me. I meticulously, carefully removed the shattered spleen, a source of relentless bleeding. I packed the liver with gauze to control the diffuse, oozing hemorrhage from the bruised tissue. I was a machine of repair, an artist of anatomy, a master of crisis. I was saving the man I hated most in the world, and with every precise, life-giving movement, with every decision that pulled him back from the precipice, I felt like I was suturing closed a deep, festering wound in my own soul. Each stitch in his artery was a stitch in my own ragged heart. Each sponge placed was absorbing my own spilled bitterness. It was the most painful, most exhausting, and most profoundly moral act of my life. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a lifetime spent in that single, brightly lit room, it was over. The bleeding was controlled. The delicate repair was holding. His vital signs, while critically fragile, had stabilized, finding a new, tenuous equilibrium. The numbers on the monitor were no longer screaming in panic, but whispering in cautious, fragile hope. He would live. He would be wheeled up to the ICU, a temple of constant vigilance, and if the gods of medicine and fate were kind, if his body had the will, he would wake up. He would open his eyes to a world that still contained him. I stepped back from the table, my body aching with a fatigue that went straight to the marrow of my bones, a weariness of the spirit as much as of the flesh. The adrenaline drained away, leaving me feeling hollowed out, weightless, and terrifyingly empty. The team began the process of closing, the mood in the room shifting from high-stakes crisis to methodical, almost peaceful completion. I walked out of the OR, pulling my surgical cap off, my hair damp with sweat, my mask hanging loose around my neck. I walked past the bustling nurses' station, past the families huddled in worried, silent clusters, and into the stark, empty silence of the doctor's lounge. I sat alone in the dark, my head in my hands, the scent of his blood still a phantom, persistent smell in my nostrils, the feel of his pulsing artery against my finger a ghostly sensation I couldn't shake. I didn't cry. I just felt empty. Scoured out. Purged. I had faced the monster from my past, the ghost in my machine, the living embodiment of my deepest pain, and I had healed him. I had poured my skill, my knowledge, my very purpose into keeping him alive. I didn't know if I felt noble or like the worst kind of traitor to my own family, to the memory of my father, to the silent suffering of my mother. I felt suspended between two identities, the surgeon and the daughter, and I didn't know which one had one. The following days were a strange, surreal purgatory. I became a ghost in my own hospital, moving through the corridors with a detached air. I deliberately, consciously avoided his ICU room, assigning his post-operative care to my trusted, capable colleagues, citing a need to focus on other complex cases. But I was obsessed, possessed by his condition. I checked his electronic charts obsessively, multiple times an hour, my login a constant presence on his record. I pored over his lab results, his hemoglobin, his coagulation factors, his liver enzymes, his vital sign trends, his nurse's notes, reading them like a cryptic novel about my own life, searching for clues not just to his recovery, but to the meaning of my own actions. Patient is following commands. That meant his brain was working, his mind was intact. The mind that had concocted the lies that broke my father. Patient is extubated. He was breathing on his own, drawing the air my father could no longer breathe. Patient is alert and oriented. He was aware. He was conscious. He was, once again, a thinking, feeling person in the world. Each note was a stone dropped into the still, dark pond of my conflicted heart, sending out ripples of a confusion I couldn't name, relief, anger, disappointment, a strange, perverse pride. I knew, with a dread that felt like a physical sickness in my stomach, that I had to see him. I had to look him in the eye. I told myself it was a professional necessity, a follow-up for a complex surgical case, the attending surgeon checking on her handiwork, ensuring the integrity of the repair. But that was a thin, transparent lie I told only myself, a flimsy shield against the truth. I needed to know if he would see me. If, in some deep, hidden corner of his soul, some spark of memory, some flicker of a long-buried conscience would ignite. Would there be a flicker of recognition? A dawning horror as the pieces clicked into place? A shameful, cowardly avoidance of my gaze? I needed to see the man, not just the patient. I needed to confront the ghost and see if it was still a monster, or if it was just a man, reduced by time and circumstance and a steering wheel. The day I finally walked into his room, the late afternoon sunlight was streaming through the large window, casting long, warm shadows and catching dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, carefree spirits. He was propped up in bed, looking old and frail and small, the lines on his face deepened by pain and the profound ordeal of his illness. The vibrancy, the charismatic, almost overwhelming energy I remembered from my childhood was gone, completely leached away by time and trauma. He was just a man. A broken, vulnerable, old man in a standard-issue hospital gown. He looked up as I entered, and he gave me a small, weak, but genuine, unforced smile. "You must be one of my doctors," he said, his voice raspy and thin from the assault of the breathing tube. "I'm Dr. Evans," I said, my own voice surprisingly steady, the professional mask firmly, expertly in place. "I was your surgeon." His eyes, a faded, watery blue, held no spark of recognition. None. There was no jolt, no sudden intake of breath, no shadow of the past falling over his face like a shroud. Just a polite, grateful, simple warmth. He saw a woman in a white coat, a savior, a symbol of the institution that had saved him. He did not see Antonio and Isabella Rossi's daughter. He did not see the ghost of his own greatest sin. "Well, Dr. Evans," he said, and he even tried to shift himself up a little in the bed, a gesture of respect that felt like a twist of the knife. "They tell me I was in pretty bad shape. The nurses, they all say you worked a miracle in there. That you spent hours." He paused, his voice catching with a genuine, simple emotion. "Thank you. From the bottom of my heart, thank you for saving my life." The words hung in the air between us, immense and suffocating, filling the entire sunlit room. "Thank you for saving my life." From the man who had, directly or indirectly, taken my father's. The irony was so perfect, so devastating, it felt like a physical force, a vacuum that pushed all the air from my lungs. He had no idea. The cosmic, brutal joke was entirely lost on him. To him, I was just a skilled stranger, an angel of mercy who had stepped out of the void to pull him back from the edge. The past, our shared, terrible, life-altering past, was a book he had never read, a story he had forgotten, a debt he had never known he owed, a grave he had never visited. I stood there, my white coat feeling like a costume, my stethoscope a meaningless prop around my neck. The power I had felt in the war, the godlike power of life and death, was gone. In its place was a staggering, disorienting powerlessness. The scales of justice were gone. I was just a woman in a room with an old man. I could have said it. I could have leaned in close, my voice low and cold, and whispered, "My name is Lena. Lena Rossi. Does that name mean anything to you, Arthur? Does Antonio Rossi ring a bell? Do you remember the house with the lavender bushes?" I could have watched the gratitude drain from his face, replaced by shock, then dawning horror, then perhaps even fear. I could have seen the shame wash over him, the realization that his savior was the living embodiment of his greatest failure. I could have had my moment of confrontation, my long-awaited, blood-soaked reckoning. But as I looked at him, at the genuine, uncomplicated, simple thankfulness in his tired old eyes, at the utter lack of guile or hidden knowledge, I realized something that fundamentally, permanently shifted something inside me. My revenge wasn't in his recognition or his pain. My victory wasn't in his suffering or his shame. My victory was in the choice I had already made on that operating table, in the split second when my finger was on his pulsing artery and my soul was on the line. I had looked into the abyss of my own hatred, I had felt its seductive, cold, easy embrace, and I had chosen, consciously and deliberately, not to jump. I had chosen the oath. I had chosen the scalpel as a tool of life, not a weapon of death. I had chosen to be the healer, not the executioner. By saving him, by affirming the very core of who I had striven to become, I had finally, truly, saved myself from being consumed by the monster he had created in me. I had broken the cycle of destruction. I had chosen to build, not to ruin. And that was a victory no one could ever take from me. I simply nodded, the professional mask softening into something that felt almost real, almost peaceful. "It's my job," I said softly, my voice quiet but clear in the sunlit room. "You're not out of the woods yet, but you're stable. You have a long, difficult recovery ahead. But the team here is excellent. They'll take good care of you." I turned and walked out of the room. The hallway seemed brighter, the air easier to breathe, as if a weight I had been carrying for 25 years had finally been lifted from my chest. The ghost that had haunted me for a quarter of a century, the specter that had colored every decision, every relationship, every quiet, unguarded moment of my life, was just a sick, grateful, ordinary old man in a hospital bed. He had no power over me anymore. The chains I had been carrying, the chains of anger and grief and a thirst for vengeance, I had finally, with my own hands, unlocked myself. The story doesn't end with a dramatic, movie-style confrontation or a tearful, emotional reconciliation where he begs for forgiveness and I grant it. He was discharged a few weeks later, transferred to a rehab facility, and I heard through the hospital grapevine that he eventually moved to another state to live with a sister he had mentioned. The chapter was closed. The book was finished. He faded back into the anonymity from which he had come. But its lesson is etched into me, deeper than any scar, more fundamental than any surgical technique I will ever learn, more a part of me than my own DNA. I still step into the ore every day. I still gown and glove, I still feel the cool, familiar weight of the scalpel in my hand, I still put my hands on broken, bleeding bodies, on lives hanging by a thread. And I understand now, with a clarity that is almost painful in its intensity, that the greatest battle a healer ever faces isn't against disease or trauma or the relentless, inevitable march of time. It's against the darkness inside ourselves. The temptation to play God, to mete out our own personal, flawed, human sense of justice. The seductive whisper that says some lives are worth less than others, that some people deserve their fate. We hold life and death in our hands every single day, a sacred, terrifying responsibility. But the true, ultimate measure of our strength, of our character, is not just our technical skill, our knowledge, our steady hands, but what we choose to do with that power when the life on the line belongs to our enemy, to our ghost, to the living embodiment of our deepest, most profound pain. That is the final, and most important, surgery we will ever perform, the one on our own soul. The man who destroyed my family didn't even recognize me. And in the end, that was the greatest, most liberating gift he could have ever given me. It forced me to find my absolution not in his apology, not in his acknowledgement of the pain he caused, not in any external validation, but in my own compassion. It forced me to define my own morality, separate from his actions, to build my own code of ethics on the bedrock of my choices, not on the quicksand of his failures. It taught me that the past can only define you if you carry its poison in your heart, if you let it dictate your choices in the present, if you allow it to turn you into a mirror image of the very thing that hurt you. I chose to put it down. I chose to heal. Not just his body, but my own spirit. And in doing so, I finally, completely, set myself free. The weight is gone. The anger has dissipated. All that's left is the light, and the work. And it is enough. It is more than enough.